the Worth Knowing live stream on my Substack, Worth Knowing with Matt Robison, but also simultaneously on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn. This live stream is just about the last thing that focuses on government and that Democrats tend to like that's still going to be operating in a few short hours, because that's when the federal government is due to shut down. And look, I've been writing and doing radio and podcasting and live streaming for several years now. And if I've learned one thing along the way, it's that people just aren't that interested in talking about government shutdowns. Cliff Schechter and I talk about this all the time. Like, all the articles I've written and episodes I've done over the years that focus on government funding and budgets and, yes, shutdowns, just simply tend to generate less interest. And I get it. The whole topic smacks of math. And even if regression analysis is my love language and poring over spreadsheets is a great way of threatening me with a good time, not everyone feels that way. That's cool. But in this case, with this shutdown, it's everything that's underneath it that's interesting, because it raises some deep questions about what the Democratic Party is all about, whether there's any way for them to fight back against what Donald Trump is doing to the country, and really what the whole future of the anti-MAGA movement is. And there are fundamental legal questions as well, including the basic issue of whether the laws that Congress passes are even relevant anymore at a time where we have a president who is able to openly defy the law without repercussions. Seriously, Congress passed a law banning TikTok and TikTok. Well, there you go. TikTok. And Trump simply said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Even worse, as I wrote about on the Worth Knowing Substack on September 8th, Donald Trump is flagrantly and obnoxiously defying the law to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars with no accountability from the media whatsoever. Seriously, look it up. Under the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the president has to spend what the Congress tells them to spend. And there's more than $400 billion that Trump has simply refused to release. This is 100% against the law and almost as bad. A haphazard spending cut of this magnitude is hurting the macroeconomy and hitting Trump's own voters, which of course gets back to the whole question of the shutdown. And can you even make a deal or pass a law that will hold in this country anymore? Sidebar, I wrote about all of this for Newsweek in an article that should be coming out very soon. We'll get into more of that in a few minutes. But we should also get into some of those other underlying issues that the shutdown fight is bringing to the surface, because today's expert guest has been writing about a nexus of related topics on his Substack that have a common thread running through them. In his recent articles, he's been talking about political fundraising, why Democrats should become the anti-corruption party, and how voters are making their choices. And what comes through in all of it is just how deeply broken our entire political system is. Because we're raising billions of dollars to elect representatives, except we're not sure all that money is doing what we intend it to. And then those representatives go to pass laws that our president ignores, and our Supreme Court says, well, that's fine. And then our government shuts down entirely. What we're seeing today and in the shutdown fight is in many ways the apotheosis of dysfunction, where all the broken cogs in our system creak into a total collapse. But maybe it's also the kind of breakdown that's necessary in order to start making a repair, the grinding sound from your car engine that finally makes you go see the mechanic. And the person I want to ask about all of this is our outstanding guest, Adam Monica, professor of political science at Stanford University. I've heard of it. It is a highly august institution, a delightfully nerdy author of the endlessly fascinating Substack on data and democracy. Adam, you had me at data.
Well, thanks for having me on, Matt, and looking forward to reading the Newsweek piece. It was a very astute.
I have an upcoming
description of our current situation. So,
I'm glad you generally are able to endorse it, because I'm going to run a real-time experiment on you in a few minutes in which I might humiliate myself. I'm going to ask an actual expert to evaluate my thesis. Oh, professor, I can't wait for the grade that you're going to give me on this. But let's start off with this. We are barreling toward the shutdown. All caveats understood. Like I said at the outset there, people don't care about shutdowns, but I do care about the larger issues that the shutdown represents. Not to mention, it's going to have a hell of an impact on real people. So my question is this in your mind the right fight? Is this the fight Democrats need to have? And are those the same thing?
So, yeah, I would say the right fight, I guess, wouldn't be the way I would put it. It is a fight worth having. All of these issues get to the core of our constitutional framework and structure. As you mentioned, there had been a long-standing, well-understood legal and constitutional precedent that presidents cannot refuse to spend money that has been allocated by Congress. So this goes back to the U.S. v. Nixon case in the 70s, as you'd mentioned, post-Watergate, and then it was reaffirmed again by the Supreme Court when they struck down the presidential line item veto during the Clinton administration.
Right.
The Supreme Court's extremely lenient on these things, and it's giving the president far more power than you would expect them to give other presidents. But generally speaking, this sort of system, this sort of, as you'd mentioned, like people don't really care about these fights over shutdowns like you would expect them to, because they're just so frequent. They happen every year. I teach a course on American political institutions. There's always a government shutdown or budget battle that, brings things up to this brinkmanship level, and then often gets resolved through a continuing resolution, but sometimes does not. The fight here, I think, it's not so much about whether I think the budget is the right sort of like battlefield to fight on, but the issues that need to be brought up, right? Like these are fundamental constitutional issues. These are, in the context of everything else that's happening, the, deterioration of civil rights, sending troops into cities, the birthright citizenship being challenged despite it being a clear and like unambiguous statement within the Constitution. You can make this fight about anything you want it to be. I'm not sure trying to protect healthcare subsidies, which is a worthwhile cause, brings the fight to the level that you would expect for an opposition party.
That was actually going to be my next question, because political analysts have been kind of kicking this around for the last month or so, ever since the writing was on the wall. I think my Newsweek piece, I said, ever since this freight train started barreling down the track at us, is this the right stake in the ground to plant on ACA subsidies, healthcare more generally? Nate Silver, who's not always, the favorite of folks on the left, but, has some interesting perspectives, saying, look, in the New York Times, fight on tariffs, fight on the fact that the president has overstepped his constitutional authority and his congressional legal authority on his ridiculous tariffs. Put the focus there on the economic pain that he's causing. It's an interesting point. If you could choose, would you make the bargaining chip, the thing that you have to get done in order to keep the funding for the government going? Would you make it ACA subsidies, or would you make it something else?
I think that's way too small of an ask. I think it's it sort of lends to this, I think, correct perception of the Democratic Party, especially its leadership, that they're not worried about the very serious attacks on civil society and the types of things that are happening in this country that are really consequential. They're more concerned about, restoring a status quo that people have resoundingly rejected. Voters have, coming up before the Trump administration, the status quo was already really bad, right? Like we had all these issues, and it just comes across as protecting an existing status quo that just is not popular, and just sort of like pushing around the edges, as opposed to saying, no, we need, this is a moment where things are breaking, and we have an opportunity for fundamental reform, and we need to lay out what our plan is for that. Not, in these budget debates, you have the opportunity to state your demands and be very clear about what you want and what you want to prevent the president from doing. They're sort of squandering that opportunity by saying, we're just going to be very pragmatic and see if we can get a little bit out of this. We don't want to be seen as, too much of rocking the boat.
Right.
The boat's sinking, so
it's like they basically looked at a polling spreadsheet and they're like, you know where we're strongest? Healthcare. Let's just try, and that's not necessarily a wrong political argument, but all right, look, let's get to the part. I should really have like a little video sting for this. I don't. I have video stings for other things, but not for my favorite game. When I have a bona fide expert on the show, where I ask for a real-time evaluation of an argument that I'm making, a thesis that I have. Sometimes it results in people who know a heck of a lot of what they're talking about saying, well, Matt, you're all fucking wrong on that. So I'm really looking forward to this. Here you go. So what I teed up, and it's still sitting with my editors, so who knows? Maybe they'll remix it a little bit. But what I argued in my Newsweek article is that I think the way that polling has been presented in the media on who would win a shutdown fight is pretty misleading. If the question is, does it persuade any voters who are still open to persuasion? The data suggests that the answer is no, that this isn't helping Democrats to persuade persuadable voters. If the question is, would it fire up for each side their own base in a way that makes voters more likely to show up to vote? The answer is, I don't see firm evidence of that. I could be persuaded. If the question is, though, is the shutdown maybe just the table stakes? Is this the price that Democrats have to pay to get your voters to be willing to hear anything else you have to say? I think that there's a strong case that the answer is yes. So what I do in the Newsweek pieces, I lay out, look, I think this is going to be really bad. I think the consequences for the economy, for society, for Trump's ability to put Russell Vought, I said it's going to take a whole team of surgeons to wipe the smile off of Russell Vaught's face after this. I think the consequences are potentially grave, including politically, but I don't see a way around it. I've actually done a full 180. Actually, my wife jokes with me that we tend to come back to our original starting point, so it's more like a full 360. But I've done a full 180 on this, where I was really, really cautious. But now I've gotten to the point. I mean, look at the comments from people. We have them up here. Everyone is coming on to the chats and saying, shut it down. Shut it down. I think, in my mind, this is just the ante that Democratic leaders have to pay in order to resume some kind of a unified direction for the party. What do you make of my thesis?
It sounds correct and spot on to me.
I feel much better.
I think the one of the premises you lay out is that we're over a year away from the next election. This will be long forgotten by the time. So whatever polling data we're looking at is just this sort of ephemeral, temporary blip that is going to be completely subsumed by everything else that's going to happen in the next year. It's not like this has been an uneventful year and next year is going to be even more eventful. So this notion that we need to, be very concerned about our margins on this specific issue is, I think, a very oddly short-sighted viewpoint, right? So I think you're correct there that, I use polling data. I think polling data is really useful, especially for understanding priorities. Seeing where the presidential approval rating is dipping 1 or 2 percent points on, some action that the opposition party's doing is probably not what you should be trying to maximize. The other aspect that you bring up is, okay, so we think about the polling data as maybe how does it affect Trump's approval rating? How does it affect Chuck Schumer's approval rating, or Hakeem Jeffries' approval rating, or the Democratic Party's approval rating? One of the most depressing things about this moment that you see in polling data is that people are no happier with the Democratic Party than they are with the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is at a historic low in approval ratings, and that includes, especially among their own voters. Chuck Schumer has something like a -33 approval rating, which is a hard thing to achieve for a leader. There's just no other country or democracy that I know of that a party leader with that type of negative approval rating would be able to survive for more than a few months. And right. In the US, it's just standard. We just have become used to it, but it's so unusual and it's probably so harmful for the party. if there's like not either a correction by those who are in the leadership to correct their really dismal approval ratings, or changing leadership. And so I think you're right. Like, I think maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're also thinking about, we're in the midst of coalitional politics. A lot is up for grabs. The key thing that an opposition party needs to focus on is its coalition, not some approval rating that's like not actually tied to anything. If you have a large group of people who are willing to stand up and fight for what the party's putting forward and believes in, that's going to be a far more useful tool in a moment of authoritarian gains and democratic backsliding than anything you can get out of like a marginal persuasion of a dwindling set of swing voters that the empirical evidence suggests that they're just not the main electoral prize. At one point they were, but it's not the same as it was back in the 80s or 90s.
Well, that's a great bridge to something that I really wanted to ask you about that you wrote about recently, which is laying out a case that Democrats have to become the anti-corruption party. And part of what I hear you saying is we tend to invert the cause and effect in our minds of polling and issues and how voters feel about where the parties are on issues, and therefore how they evaluate the parties, as if people go comparison shopping at Walmart, which I guess is a dirty word for Amethyst Peony, who was getting screwed over on the phone. Sorry to hear that, my friend. But it's not like people go into their Walmart and they're like, well, I see the Democrats are here on immigration and Republicans are here, and over here on trade. It's not necessarily that mode of action. It's much more about sort of like the core, vibes the wrong word, but the core brand, what you're about, what you stand for. Like what in a world. I used to do this exercise with people in articles where I'd say, all right, here's why Democrats lose. It's because there should be some like online term for this, like some kind of theorem for the fewest number of words in an explanation wins. And I would challenge people to say, what does the Republican Party stand for? Now, this is no longer true. You can't do this over the last 10 years, ever since Trump scrambled all the swim lanes. I don't even know what being on the left or the right means anymore in Trump's Republican Party. But I used to challenge people in the good old quaint days. What does the Republican Party stand for? Low taxes, traditional social values, strong military, interventionist military. I mean, small government. People would spit out some nexus of those 3 or 4 things. Now, what does the Democratic Party stand for? Right? It was like the hardest question in politics. And I think we're kind of back in a version of that now. At least the Republican Party has the coming to America answer, where Prince Hakeem meets his intended bride and he says, what do you like? And she says, whatever you like. At least Republicans can say, I'm for whatever Trump's for. And it's simple, straightforward. It feeds into the authoritarian impulse. For Democrats, we don't have a tent pole. And what you're suggesting is that fighting corruption should be the Democratic Party tent pole. Why?
There are a lot of reasons for this. The main one is that it is, so if we want to talk about polling data, and I am almost in disbelief of some of the polling results I see on corruption. People consistently, when asked in like what's their biggest concern about American government, they say corruption. There's even this poll that Chapman University does every year, and they ask people what their biggest fear is. And I still don't even understand how to interpret this. But in 9 years running, it's been public corruption. Like that's the widest held fear, above like having your like family and friends fall sick. Obviously, it's like the intensity is probably not the same, but like people are pointing to it every time they have a chance to say something in a survey. The thing that they want to raise to the top, it appears to be corruption. The recent YouGov poll that asked people whether they thought, different types of politicians at different levels of office, including Congress or mayors or presidents, would accept would be likely to accept a bribe. That's a horrific statement from the American public. They are,
and for those catching this on audio later, the numbers are overwhelming. Okay. The take home here is everyone thinks that everyone is overwhelmingly likely to accept a bribe.
And so we have that like baseline for knowing that this is something that should be on the radar. Then we have many, many examples from around the world of how effective opposition coalitions have combated authoritarian regimes. Far and away, without any exception, the most powerful and effective message has been an anti-corruption message. Largely because without accountability, which is something that consolidated authoritarians do not have to deal with, corruption runs rampant. We literally had an example of this just a few weeks ago in Nepal, where a corrupt authoritarian regime was overthrown by a youth coalition and now has an interim president who was chosen because she is an anti-corruption figure. We have protests in Serbia right now that are threatening to topple the regime about anti-corruption because there was supposed to be money that went towards a rail station that didn't get spent on the rail station, and there was a massive tragic accident, and like dozens, hundreds of people, I think, died and were injured. And this just sparked outrage among the public, and there's a consistent protest. We saw this in Bangladesh. We see this in pretty much any example of an effective opposition movement. Anti-corruption is a huge part of it. The other reason why I think it's especially important for the US context is that we are a highly polarized society. And when you have a highly polarized society, it's just very hard to make gains by sort of like triangulating on, that left-right, liberal, conservative like position and trying to be really cautious about who's in the like political center and who's not. Because the gains always come with some trade-off, right? Like you move to the center, you may, make a bunch of people who are on the left become more disillusioned, right? This is a pretty well-known sort of phenomenon, and like people are very clear about how this works. Anti-corruption has a very different appeal. One, it's broadly appealing. Secondly, it's not depolarizing, so it doesn't bring the parties closer together. It does something called repolarizing. So compare it, like scholars of like comparative authoritarianism talk about how this can be a really effective strategy, that if you're just stuck in this polarized society where you have these two camps, one of the best things to do is to build a broader coalition that just says, we're not fighting on that anymore. We're fighting on that, but also the thing that we're going to be pushing on for now is anti-corruption. So I think it has a lot of advantages. Problem is, if we're referencing back to that plot you showed, people think Democrats are just as corrupt as Republicans. I disagree with that on a like scale, like in terms of like the scale of corruption, but I don't think people are misreading the situation to think that both parties have a problem.
I think that was one of the things that I'd actually prepped in looking through this article is exactly what MJ is raising here, which is there are, and I agree with both of you, honestly. The scale on the Republican side, at least recently, has dwarfed the scale on the Democratic side. Trump alone, my gosh, Forbes estimated that his family has enriched itself to the tune of $10 billion through his corrupt scams, his cyber. It's absolutely stunning. And the way he's leveraged government power, federal power, lawmaking and law keeping power to enable his corruption is what's truly breathtaking. But MJ's got a point too, that you've got these poster children, Bob Menendez, Eric Adams, or you even get confusion and water muddying in the case of people like James Comey, who, it's like he probably prosecutors didn't want to prosecute what he is being indicted for because they said there's no evidence of this here, that there was a crime here. But it gets headlines because you got to cover it, and it's confusing. It is confusing to casual news consumers, which is most of us, among whom Trump wins handily. And it muddies the water. I mean, You can even see it in a recent case. Oh, I'm going to be controversial here. All right, go ahead, chats. Lay into me. If people disagree with what I'm about to say, I can take it. But like, take the case of Senator Al Franken, right? Here's a guy who behaved badly, but also was clearly set up in a right-wing kind of like assembled, arranged sting operation. And Democrats decided to invoke a purity test. And maybe we were right to. I mean, he certainly behaved badly. But on the other hand, it's unclear to me that we got a political benefit. It's unclear to me that voters said, wow, you know what? Treating women as equals with respect and standing against sexual harassment is a core value, and the Democrats have it. Republicans don't. Therefore, I'm with the Democrats. It doesn't seem like that really broke through. And it, in this day and age, politicians have shown, none more than Trump himself, that you can just stand there and brazen it out and just Darvo the whole situation. So I guess my hesitancy, as much as I agree with you, is I just don't know, with the existence of counterexamples, I don't know if we could pull it off.
This is sort of core to my read of the situation and thesis of like how to move forward too. I agree with MJ. The Democrats have a massive corruption problem. And it's not just like these like taking bribes of gold bars in bags. That's a form of very obvious corruption. But, to most people of the American public, I would include myself, we have an entire class of legalized corruption that has pervaded our institutions and political system. The types of, when you give massive donations to a candidate or a party and expect there to be no influence or access return, that's just unrealistic, and it's just not what happens. So the notion that the Democratic Party could just be like, okay, now we're the anti-corruption party and we'll just criticize Trump, that's just hollow, right? They need to self-reform first. They do need to go out of their way and say, this is something that's important to us, and it's important enough to us that we are going to voluntarily move first. Do things like, we're going to be very tough on anyone in our coalition that we consider, or like that people consider corruptors engaged in any type of corrupt behavior. Like Andrew Cuomo is another example, right? So types of things he did and the types of corruption, the charges that were levied at him were not as serious as Eric Adams, but in a lot of ways, but they were also far more consequential in covering up what had happened in nursing homes and so forth. And yet the party establishment has been pretty comfortable in backing Cuomo. And I mean, just going back to the leadership discussion, I was blown away when Hakeem Jeffries went out of his way to thank and praise Eric Adams in a message the other day. And it's just sort of,
what the hell, Hakeem?
I mean, I don't know what the strategy is there. I really cannot parse it, but it sent a signal to me that he's like, oh, I'm totally cool with public corruption. And if the Democratic Party wants to adopt the strategy that has so much empirical support and backing behind it in terms of what we've seen elsewhere, how it's been effective in U.S. politics, going back to like one of the great reformers of U.S. politics and history, Teddy Roosevelt, laying out many of the same issues that would be prime anti-corruption territory today, about money in politics and like the power of oligarchs and trusts. Those types of messages really can unify different groups of people that are, and largely the ones who are disengaged. If your leadership is not on board with any of that self-reform, if they're not willing to say something like, look, we're going to not just say that we're going to ban like congressional stock trading if we get into office and then maybe we'll take a vote, and instead saying, actually, no, the new rules of our party is we're going to expect and ask in an official capacity our own members to put their investments in a blind trust now. We're going to move forward, and we're going to do it because we think it's the right thing to do. And it's a strong signal to send to the public that we're cleaning house, even if the Republicans aren't, even if there's not the force of law behind it. That's the type of message that would resonate. Saying
Right.
Trump's corrupt and we're maybe a little bit less corrupt is not going to do the trick. It's just not what an anti-corruption movement is going to look like.
It's two thoughts. One is this always stuck in my craw as a congressional staffer, along with all of my colleagues when Nancy Pelosi became speaker in 2007. One of her first acts was to get rid of low-lying temptations to corruption. You know, you could only take a staffer out for $25 for lunch, but not 30, not 30. So I had to turn down a lunch from a not-for-profit that was doing an education program for kids in Maine because they wanted to take me to a $30 lunch. And boy, they were going to have me there. And meanwhile, you know, you have members of Congress who are deeply invested in companies that they regulate. It's absolutely insane. But that is a total sidebar. That's a digression. I mean, I want to go back to a comment from Cyber Grief. I love people's handles. People have better handles than I do. I have handle envy for Cyber Grief. And what you're doing is you're echoing an H.L. Mencken quote, which is, democracy is the theory that people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. And I have this sinking feeling, and we can move off corruption in a moment, but I have a sinking feeling that one of the reasons that Trump has not been sunk by his corruption is that people kind of like the rogue figure. They kind of like they like getting rich. They like the idea of rich bad boys who get away with what they want because they sort of want to live that way. They don't mind a certain level of corruption. I don't know. Maybe I'm being cynical, but I just haven't seen a penalty for it. In my mind, I've been really, since I read your article, which, by the way, for people, I'm not just, I should have found a way to access your subscriber list. I am a subscriber to Adam's Substack. And if you are any kind of data nerd, if you like the numbers, if you like people who make an empirical case for things, this is the Substack for you. But ever since I read your Democrats have to become the anti-corruption party article, I've been turning this over in my mind. And the only formulation that works to me, that I think might stand a chance, is a contrast, turning it into, it's not to try to claim purity, because we'll never get there. We will always spew out another example that Republicans can point to say, oh, well, Eric Adams, Bob Menendez, maybe they'll make it up, Hunter Biden. I think the only way to do it is with a contrast where you say, is this what you voted for? You wanted lower grocery bills. You got Trump getting rich off of crypto. Is that what you voted for? You wanted more manufacturing jobs. We've got a 33% higher trade deficit today. Trump family just made $10 billion. Is that what you voted for? I don't know that would work. I certainly haven't poll tested it, but that's just kind of where my gut goes. I mean, feel free to weigh in, or we can move on to another issue that you've written about that I feel very passionate about.
Yeah, well, what you bring up in terms of Trump and his anti-corruption appeal, on the one hand, it's like he somehow has managed to occupy the anti-corruption lane by driving on the wrong side of the road. But
right.
And he did this from the very onset. If you think back to his sort of rocket fuel when he was running in the Republican primaries in 2015, it was this two-pronged approach. It was, look, I know how corrupt everyone is. Like, I buy off politicians. I give them money and they do what I want. And you can't do that to me because I don't need your money. I mean, that was not entirely true, but like that was the appeal to people who wanted to believe it. And this notion of, I may be corrupt, but I know how corrupt the system is, and I will call it out, I think had more power than we had been willing to admit, because like on its surface, if you know like what he's saying and what he is, like that's just pure hypocrisy. But it's not to someone who doesn't think in the same way as we do. And I think at the same time, like we saw a similar type of movement at that same period with Bernie Sanders, where both of these insurgent candidates were saying essentially the same thing. Our politicians are bought and sold, and that's the fundamental problem in our system, and that's the thing that that they were running on and wanted to change. And Bernie Sanders probably had a far more legitimate case for that, but I think the acknowledgement of how corrupt things were was something you didn't see from the establishment of either party, and that was something that really, it's still sort of true today.
And because of that, Democrats have sort of allowed themselves to be cornered into the position of being the defenders of institutions that people don't like and don't trust. And as MJ is pointing out, MJ always with the spot on commentary in these live streams, MJ writes, won't work. I presume about my formulation of the contrast. I've tried it with MAGA. They say, I'm jealous I can't do the same. I think that's a really solid point. I mean, it goes to the thing of like, Trump is pretty straightforward about like, yeah, I'm kind of a thief. I mean, but at least I don't look down on you. I don't think you're deplorable. I think you're pretty great. Wouldn't you like to be rich too? And, but I want to connect the dot over to something you said a moment ago, which is, this sense that politicians are bought and paid for, that the entire system is broken. The entire system is corrupt. Trump's formulation is it's all rigged. Bernie's formulation is the same thing. It's all rigged, right? And you've been writing a lot about how it is fundamentally broken on the side of how we elect people, and the money we put in, what it goes toward, whether any of that works. I'm going to actually quote you because I think it's worth it. And yeah, I'm shilling for your Substack. That's what I'm doing. I'm going to make no bones about it. You wrote, the big money Democrats chase primarily funds campaign ads, perhaps the most overrated tool in politics. A large meta-analysis of 49 field experiments found campaign ads barely move vote shares. My own research, analyzing 1.2 million precinct-level results, showed that doubling an opponent's super PAC spending shifts votes by a mere 0.02%. I could go on. I actually, you know what I want to do? I want to quote another writer. I'm going to quote another writer to you. A growing number of recent studies have called into serious question whether campaign advertising across multiple forms of media, but especially TV, still has any effect on voter behavior. One from political scientists at Yale, University of California, San Diego, and UCLA found that, quote, regardless of content, context, or audience, pricey commercials do little to persuade voters, and the effect of ads was a statistically insignificant 0.007 of a percentage point. I could go on with that. Oh, by the way, that author I was quoting was me. I wrote something remarkably similar to your article in Washington Monthly a year and a half ago saying, hey, Dems, why are you betting the existence of democracy on more TV ads? Fundamentally, that's most of what we spend our campaign dollars on. And we have a ton of evidence that they barely work. Now, the evidence is mixed. And no one wants to try the real life experiment in real time with live ammo of, well, what if we just stop doing them? So I tried to suggest in my article something better. But let's start, first of all, before we get to the fundraising side, let's start on the ad side. Let's start on the output of what we're raising all this money for. How worried are you that we're all kidding ourselves about what we do in political campaigns to try to win campaigns and how much it works?
I'm not worried. I think the academic empirical evidence is very clear that it's not entirely useless, but any trade-off you make for your party brand to raise those funds is not going to be worth it. These effects are tiny. There's a recent study that's of the highest quality you can get of a study like this. It's essentially like a blind trial version where they had 30,000 Facebook users, where they were able to randomize whether they saw ads or not, political ads, and then they could measure their political behavior afterwards. So like surveyed them, they saw whether they turned out to vote, whether they donated to candidates. When they did this sort of very like rigorous experimental study, they found the same thing, that basically 0.0001% effect is a precise zero, which is a rare thing to see in empirical work, which tells me that it's just people are brushing it aside. I do want to make a caveat that there are places in American politics where money seems to matter a lot. That's the primaries. It's like early on running for office. If you can raise more money than your opponent in the primaries, that's the best predictor of whether you win. In the general elections, it seems to be far less important than basically everything else. The most important thing is whether your party is doing well or not in the general election. So these wave cycles, you see, it's not about these candidate effects. It's about how people are viewing the parties. And most importantly, it's about turnout differentials. When the Democrats are more fired up and they turn out at relatively higher rates relative to Republicans, that explains pretty much all the variation we see in the last 10 to 15 years in elections. Nothing about sort of like where the party is positioning or how much money they raise. It's essentially that that pattern of like who's turning out to vote. There are swing voters, but they're not a lot of them. But to your point, am I worried that we're sort of fooling ourselves? Absolutely. And I think the main cause of that is a consultant class that has very large conflicts of interest in what they're selling to politicians.
Right. And look, I want to be clear here that in my Washington Monthly article, what I essentially wrote was, look, I'm not saying let's get rid of all political ads, because we have not tested the proposition of one side going dark. We've tested the proposition that on the margin, we don't see an effect. We don't see a major effect, or we see, with high confidence, very small effects from the differential of having more ads or having no ads. But we've never really tried you're just not going to message, or you're only going to message in these ways, but not traditional TV ads.
Yeah.
We just don't know. We don't know what the volume of all of that does. We have enticing indications, but, so what I suggested in my article was, all right, let's not get rid of ads, but, you're raising $10 billion on the Democratic side. How about we spend $100 million of it and hire Christopher Nolan? If he could make a movie about quantum physics, and the invention of the atomic bomb, and he could make $1 billion with it, surely he could make an interesting movie about Donald Trump and how much he sucks. Let's try some other ways of dealing our messaging into the bottom of people's psyches. I'm not quite ready. And I say that in part because sometimes on this live stream, I have friends from my campaign work who are political consultants who do ads. And I think they do good work. And I think they are excellent professionals. And I think they have great political judgment. And I just don't have strong evidence that if not for their efforts, their clients wouldn't have been elected. I can also say that there was a comment here from the Cynthia Rice. I just had it up, that the trans ad that Republicans ran against Harris was very effective. There is a little bit of empirical evidence for that sometimes there are ads that clearly break through. It's also the case that further down the ballot, ads tend to be more effective. I had my former boss in Congress on this live stream a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the long-running argument that he and I had about the efficacy of having frickin' yard signs. I hate yard signs. Yard signs don't vote, but in a local election, it's probably a lot better than nothing. I can't prove it. So anyway, I think all of that, go, please.
Oh, yeah, I think we're on the same page. I don't think anyone's saying that it's an optimal strategy just to go dark and not spend on advertising.
Right.
I think both of us have a broader point that, okay, what are the trade-offs here to raising that $10 billion? Do we have to go out and find those billionaires and mega donors that are going to make the party look corrupt and ruin and harm the party brand? Is that worth it? Especially when there's ample money coming from traditional fundraising sources. The Democrats, if they didn't focus on fundraising at all, they would still raise more than Republicans overall. Democrats are in a far better position in fundraising overall structurally than Republicans are. And we've seen them outraise Republicans as a result. Republicans have become incredibly dependent on billionaires and mega donors. 58% of their donations in 2024 came from people giving over $1 million. Over 50% came from just 100 donors. right? So they have this oligarchical fundraising model. Democrats, they do get some money from billionaires, but most of the billionaires who are really like spend a lot on the Democratic side, they're like Bloomberg, who are like spending on their own contests, not on like the party itself. And so I don't know, that's sort of how I think about it. Like, what's the trade-off we're making? The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is the way fundraising has morphed into an end-all and like end in itself. So I was just running these numbers the other day, and yeah, okay, you got it right there. So this is the percentage of campaign, so like money that's fundraised. So like when a campaign raises, say, $100, what percentage of that $100 goes back towards more fundraising operations, sending out more like fundraising texts or emails, or buying buying these sort of like donor lists that allow them to target large populations of people. And the answer is, like, in 2022, we nearly saw an election where more was spent on fundraising operations than campaign advertising altogether.
More was spent on fundraising than advertising.
We were close. We almost broke even. 2026 is on track to exceed that for the first time. So about 31% in 2022, 31.5% of money spent by campaigns in 2022 went towards traditional advertising, online or TV or flyers. The rest is just sort of being funneled back into this fundraising machine. And this is where I get most of my messaging from, is from the Democratic Party. The thing that I get contacted the most about isn't like mobilizing or like, you need to be aware of this. It's, I need your $5, I need your $15. That's all I hear in terms of being a voter who's within that ecosystem. So
can I build on that exact point and tie it together with something in the chats from the incomparable Lefty Gramps saying, what year was Citizens United decided? And I'm going to pop back on this on the screen here, your graph. Interesting there. And again, for people listening on audio later, look, I'm sorry if you're listening on audio. I love listening to audio pods too, but so much is on video these days. I've gone over to the visual side. It's a very interesting point that Lefty Gramps is making, and I'm going to build on what you were just saying about the volume of political messaging that you get that comes through fundraising, essentially. I have a thesis about this, and again, we're going to do an episode of Ask the Professor. You can grade me on this. And again, I also want to give the caveat that I have good friends who do political fundraising for Democrats as their job, as their business. And I respect them. I think what they do, because I believe that there has to be some baseline level of campaigning and messaging. And because you need funds for that, I think what they do is important. I'm not against what they do at all. All of that said, I'm worried because what you just said is so important to me. If you multiply like an expected value calculation, the tone of fundraising times the volume of fundraising messages, it seems obvious to me that not only is fundraising communication the dominant form of political messaging that voters receive today, but also, and I think this is self-evident, it's by far the most vitriolic. And on top of that, because it's going to people with a high propensity to donate, it seems to be going to the base of each party, meaning the people who are the most committed partisans are getting whipped into a frenzy by the most vitriolic messaging aimed squarely at them with the most volume. And what do you observe in the data? You observe that it's those polls in the parties that are driving our polarization, that are getting more and more entrenched. And so for all of the focus in the discourse about the negative effects of social media, which I agree are probably there, more likely than not, it is interesting what Lefty Gramps is raising here, that you see this effect that you document on your Substack, the quadrupling of campaign fundraising cost, the near evening out of money spent on fundraising versus money spent on campaign ads. And, it's hard to avoid putting those puzzle pieces together and concluding that, boy, is what we're seeing in fundraising what's driving our polarization. What do you make of that entire thesis?
So I think it's part of the broader set of causes that I think you're right that on the margins, it is probably making things worse. It's, the types of messages you get. Can you imagine a reputable company sending the type of messages that we get from like the DCCC or DSCC, like fake deals and like 4-time matches, like this, like hyperbolic doomed language. Like it started around 2014 where it really got bad. And I remember there was like a set of I would keep the messages that I would get from Nancy Pelosi, and they were sort of funny because it was like she had like fallen down a well and someone needed to go rescue her. This was like the type of things like, dude, we're doomed. Like, I need your help. And it was weird at the time. And I remember talking to a digital fundraising consultant who had worked for the DCCC, who was out at Stanford for a conference. And I sort of confronted him, this maybe 2014. I was like, don't you think what's happening here? Like, yeah, maybe you can like boost your like fundraising by a little bit, but think of the side effects of this. Think of how this makes the party look. Think about how it fatigues donors. In the long run, do you really think this is a good strategy? And his answer was just bluntly like, every election cycle is a new election cycle. And this was around the time like they were like the same sort of group of digital fundraising consultants had found out that if you had texted these fundraising messages at around midnight on Friday or Saturday, they were more effective. It was because people were drunk. And they were exploiting that, and it became like a big find within that community. I was like, that's exploitative. Like you're trying to
can I just add one to just like your behind the scenes thing? I was in when I was a congressional chief of staff. They'd occasionally drag you over to the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the arm of the Democratic National Committee that focuses on the U.S. House of Representatives. Okay. And they drag us over for training. Some of them were delightful, like when James Carville came in to talk to all the chiefs of staff about running campaigns and, memorably said, like most people think campaigns are about strategy. You got one thumb in your mouth, the other thumb up your butt. You switch them every half hour. You feel like you've accomplished something. I don't know what that means, but I just love quoting it every chance I get. But one of the memorable sessions was about campaign fundraising. And I remember very distinctly, and I wonder if people in the chats remember this too, when the email must have been about 2006, maybe 7 or 8. There was a fundraising email with the subject line "knife fight," and it was a game changer. It was an all-time record breaker. I can't even remember the campaign it was in, but they pointed to it. They're like, "This is how you get attention: the extremity, the violence, the visual. You're in a knife fight." And at the time, that was edgy and attention grabbing, and like I said, record breaking effective. Now, my gosh, if you're not referring to some kind of weapon in your fundraising, what are you even doing? Yeah. So anyway,
it all sounds very unhealthy, and it's also so I've done, like, as you probably know, I've done a lot of research into what this type of fundraising does and how it works. And it's quite depressing that really what's happening is we get these messages now and you look at it and like, what is this? This is weird. Like, why are they sending me this message that's like saying, no one's giving, like, I'm crying here because no one's donating. Like, you've let me down, you've forsaken me type stuff. Just like really weird stuff that you wouldn't expect to get from any normal operation. And part of the reason it now operates that way is because these are actually just like transplanted strategies that have been used by people who are running elder financial fraud, like operations, like these sort of emotional appeals and these urgency, you have to do something right now, or the Forex match that does not exist is going to disappear. These are effective because they are targeting people, largely vulnerable seniors. And that's where pretty much all of this money from that type of fundraising is being raised. It's actually not like a broad set of us. Like we're not, like most people look at those messages and you're not actually supposed to respond to it. It's supposed to filter you out if you're not susceptible to that type of messaging. And what they'll do is they'll get seniors, and it appears that they will just message them over and over and over again. Usually people who have weakened cognitive defenses or have experienced like early stages of dementia, and they will just squeeze them for money. Like sometimes there's like people in the data set that are, like an 80 like 9-year-old woman who is given 7,500 times over the last 5 years for a total of like $70,000. There's other people giving hundreds of thousands of dollars, and from these repeat donations from these types of fundraising messages. And they're not rich. They, like you can see, they live in middle class neighborhoods or like rural areas. It's really unethical and unseemly, the way that this fundraising has evolved. And that's not like most candidates themselves are not engaging in that type of behavior, but there's an entire ecosystem that the party system essentially condones at this point. And it's, this is sort of like the end stage of, if you only care about raising that X dollar, no matter how you do it, you're going to end up using tactics that are not okay. And something slipped here. Like there's no reason that the party should be doing that. And that the other frustrating part of it is basically none of that money makes it back to the party or the candidates. Pretty much all goes back into these fundraising operations and is funneled back to consulting firms. And so back to your point, there are plenty of people in the consulting arena who are like well-meaning, good, ethical people. The problem is that seems like the most financially successful people in that ecosystem of the consulting system are largely not ethical. And this goes back to my point of, the corruption, legalized corruption in the Democratic Party. Nothing I described about these fundraising practices is legal, but it doesn't mean that it's okay. And it doesn't mean something that the party should, you shouldn't treat your own supporters like marks. That should be, like coalition building 101. And I don't know, I think it's part and parcel of this whole rot that has really sort of festered within both parties, but the Democratic Party is not at all immune to it. They're fully participating in this type of behavior. And I think these are the types of things that should be easy to reform, but because of these institutional constraints and the powers that be, they end up being sort of like, oh, it's okay. Like, like Act Blue is trying to clean shop. Like they are actively like put new rules in place to say like these predatory like fundraising practices are not allowed on the platform. But how do they enforce that if the DCCC is also using those, right? So they would have to, like, if they were to start kicking people, like organizations off their platform, they would have to make an exception for the official party committees because like a lot of the messages I get from them are in clear violation of what Act Blue's policies are. And I think this points to there are a lot of people within the party trying to reform things, but it's going to need action from the leadership, and I don't see that forthcoming.
I think one of the hard things here, and I want to try to bring this full circle in part because we're reaching the top of the hour and people are busy in their lives, especially you. I feel like I should Richard Kimball you and call you Dr. Adam Bonica. I think it goes back to a lot of what you see in these systemic breakdowns in fundraising, in how we run campaigns, in how our government is operating. A lot of it is not illegal, but it's broken, and people respond to incentives. I can tell you, as a somewhat reformed campaign manager, I'm mostly reformed, I do this instead, that each campaign is its own little fiefdom, its own little small business. One of the downsides of that is that you're all in competition with one another. There's only a certain market of addressable dollars out there from Democratic Party donors, and you're fighting all the other campaigns for them. And so, yes, you have every incentive to get that dollar, no matter how you get it. What that does is it pushes campaigns to whatever extreme of marketing tactic will work to get those dollars. And look, it is all ultimately in a cause that I believe in, and I think all the people in the chats believe in, because I believe that democracy is important. So do you. It's half the title of your Substack. But it is demoralizing when it goes in service of electing candidates who then go into our representative bodies and find themselves up against an authoritarian power grab from a president who does not obey the law. And we now find ourselves in a position where we are forced, for all kinds of reasons that I outlined in my Newsweek article and that we've just talked about, we're forced to hold the line on shutting down the government because we have to, because the alternatives are worse. And so you can't blame people for walking away from a conversation like this and from everything they see out in the world and saying, my gosh, it is all so deeply, deeply broken. But I don't like to bum people out on this show or in my Substack. And one of the things I teased at the top is that I do think there are ways forward. I do think we can, it starts with the government. It starts with fixing at the top and, restoring some kind of guardrail on the Mad King. And that means we have to win in 2026. That means we're going to have to gut our way through the next 13 months and find a way to that victory. And some of the way we get there is probably not going to be pretty, and it's probably going to be painful. But if we can start to get a beachhead and we can reestablish some respect for the rule of law, we can also find our way toward reforming our own house, fixing our own house. And I think there are a lot of people who are anxious to do that. I see in the chats people saying, I hate the text messages. I hate the fundraising. I don't like the campaign ads. No one likes ads. There are better ways to do these things, and we'll find them if we can get through the authoritarian emergency that we find ourselves in today. All right. That was what amounts to a closing soliloquy for me. Adam, I can't thank you enough for coming on the live stream. I'm splashing up on the screen once again, but for anyone listening on audio later, the Substack is On Data and Democracy with Dr. Adam Bonica, pronounced like Monica, professor of political science, Stanford University. Everything you write is really interesting. It's a great deep dive into questions that matter. I highly commend it to people. And thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. This was great.
And with that, we will be back next week. We've got another very exciting guest. We're lined up for notable legal mind Glenn Kessler next week, which should be a real treat. Looking forward to that. In the meantime, look, I know the shutdown is going to be hard on people. Seriously, there are people who are kind of in the way of this freight train. So hang in there. Stay safe, be well, and we will see everyone next week.